Right now, somewhere in the world, a stranger is lifting a shell to their mouth. Inside it is something raw, gray, and faintly still moving. They tip it back, swallow in one motion, and order another. To them, this is pleasure, a little luxury, maybe a story to tell later. But the very first time a human being did this, it had nothing to do with pleasure at all. It was an act of desperation, at the edge of extinction. The real story of the first oyster isn't about taste. It's about a species that almost didn't make it to tell the story at all. 200,000 years ago, your ancestors were in serious trouble. Homo sapiens existed by then, but barely. The climate had turned brutal across Africa. Rain stopped falling in places that depended on it. Grasslands that generations of humans had relied on for food began drying into dust. And the animals that lived on those grasslands moved on or died out. Some geneticists studying this period believe the entire human population may have shrunk to only a few hundred breeding individuals. A few hundred, not a few million. Your entire species may have narrowed down to a group smaller than a high school. During the worst stretch of this crisis, global sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters as water locked itself away in glaciers. Along the southern tip of Africa, that drop exposed a wide stretch of land that had once been seafloor, turning a narrow coastline into a much larger plain, rich with plants and, crucially, packed with shellfish beds that had never been touched by a human hand. While the interior of the continent was turning to dust, that strip of coast stayed alive. So where did the survivors go? What did they eat when the land itself stopped feeding them? Along the southern coast of what is now South Africa, in a set of caves overlooking the Indian Ocean, archaeologist Curtis Marion spent decades digging for the answer. The site is called Pinnacle Point, and what his team found buried in the dirt changed how scientists understand the earliest chapters of your history. Layer after layer of shell, mussels, sea snails, limpets, and oysters, older than anyone expected to find them. Careful dating placed one of these layers at 164,000 years old, making it the earliest solid evidence anywhere on Earth of humans eating food from the sea in an organized, repeated way. That word matters. Organized. This wasn't one starving person on one desperate afternoon. This was a pattern repeated for generations in the exact same spot. In that same layer, Marian's team found something stranger still, a barnacle that only grows on the skin of whales. Not on rocks, not on driftwood, on whales. Which means these early humans weren't only prying shellfish off the rocks nearby. They were finding stranded whales too, cutting into the skin and blubber, eating whatever the ocean happened to wash up. Can you picture that scene? The smell of it. The desperation of it. This wasn't a picnic on a beautiful beach. This was survival, one low tide at a time. Think about what that actually required. No refrigeration, no boats, not yet. Just cold water, sharp rocks, and a willingness to eat things that most animals wouldn't dare go near. Every single meal was a small negotiation with a hostile environment, repeated day after day for generation after generation by people who had no way of knowing their choices would eventually matter to anyone at all. And low tide, it turns out, is the key detail here. Shellfish beds aren't available whenever you want them. They're exposed only at certain points in the tide cycle, and that cycle shifts constantly with the phases of the moon, which means the people living at Pinnacle Point couldn't just wander down to the shore whenever hunger struck. They had to watch the sky. They had to track a cycle, predict a future event days in advance, and organize their movements around it. That is planning behavior. That is a primitive form of mathematics practiced by people who had never seen a written number in their lives. Long before agriculture, long before writing, long before anything you'd recognize as civilization, your ancestors were reading the moon to know exactly when the sea would feed them. You, most likely, have never had to do this. You open a refrigerator or a delivery app, and food simply appears detached from tide charts, seasons, or the moon overhead. It's easy to forget that for the overwhelming majority of human history, eating on time meant paying close attention to the sky every single day, or going hungry. And here's something else researchers found in those same layers. Red ochre, a pigment likely used for symbolic decoration, maybe on skin, maybe on tools. In other words, right alongside the shellfish, there's evidence of humans starting to think in symbols, to decorate, to mean something with color, not just survive with it. The same coastline that kept your species alive may have also been where it started to become recognizably, unmistakably human. And Pinnacle Point wasn't an isolated miracle. All over the world, wherever humans eventually reached a coastline, archaeologists have found enormous piles of discarded shells called middens, essentially ancient garbage heaps built entirely out of empty shellfish shells, stacked up over centuries. Denmark has them, Japan has them, Australia has them, North America has them. Some taller than a house, different continents, different climates, different centuries, sometimes tens of thousands of years apart, and yet again and again, completely isolated groups of humans arrived at the same solution to the same problem. When the land runs out of food, the shoreline usually hasn't. That trick, once learned, didn't stay in one place. Thousands of miles away, and tens of thousands of years later, a similar story unfolds on the opposite side of the world. Archaeologist John Erlandson has spent much of his career studying how the first humans reached the Americas, and his research points toward a route almost nobody expected. Not across the frozen heart of the continent, following herds of mammoths through the ice. Along the coast, Erlandson calls it the Kelp Highway, a nearly unbroken chain of kelp forests stretching from Japan, along the edge of Siberia, across to Alaska, and down the entire Pacific coastline toward California. Kelp forests happen to be some of the richest ecosystems on the planet, packed with shellfish, fish, seals, and seabirds, all within an easy walk of the shoreline. For people who already knew how to live off tide pools and rocky beaches, this wasn't a highway of ice and starvation. It was a highway paved with food. Step by step, generation after generation, the same instinct that first cracked open a shell in a South African cave may have carried humans along an entire ocean's edge into a hemisphere no human had ever seen. No maps, no compasses, no way of knowing what waited around the next headland. Just the knowledge, passed down and trusted completely, that wherever there were rocks and cold water, there would be something to eat clinging to them. That single piece of inherited know-how may have done more to populate the Americas than any single migration event you'll find described in a textbook. But here's the part that should really stop you for a second. That shellfish habit didn't just keep your ancestors alive long enough to migrate, it may have helped build the very brain you're using to follow this sentence right now. In 1995, anthropologists Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler proposed an idea that's come to be called the expensive tissue hypothesis. In plain English, it works like this. Your brain burns an enormous amount of energy just existing, something like a fifth of your body's total daily fuel, despite being only around 2% of your body weight. Something has to pay that bill. Aiello and Wheeler argued that as early human diets shifted toward calorie-dense, nutrient-rich foods, the digestive system, which is also expensive to run, could afford to shrink. Energy that used to go toward grinding through huge volumes of low-quality plants got freed up, and a lot of it went straight to the brain instead. Shellfish are almost perfectly built for this trade. They're dense in protein. They're rich in fatty acids your body cannot manufacture on its own, the exact fatty acids your brain tissue is largely made from. One of those fatty acids shows up constantly in nutrition research today, usually shortened to just 3 letters on a supplement label. Your body can make small amounts of it, but not nearly enough to build a brain as large and as hungry as yours. The easiest place to get a steady supply, then and now, is the ocean. Every oyster your ancestors swallowed on that South African coastline may have been, in a very real sense, brain food, hundreds of thousands of years before anyone put that phrase on a bottle of fish oil supplements. Isn't it strange to think about? The organ you're using right now to follow this sentence, to feel curious, to wonder what happens next, may exist in its current form partly because a small group of desperate people on a cliff in Africa learned to pry shells off rocks. You like a good origin story. Most people do. A single brave person standing at the edge of the unknown, making a bold choice that changes everything. It's a satisfying shape for a story to take. It's just usually not what happened. There's an old joke, centuries old at this point, that it must have taken a remarkably brave person to eat the very first oyster. Something ugly enough, slimy enough, that no sane person would try it unless daring themselves to. It's a funny line. It's also almost certainly wrong. Nobody sat on a beach, stared down at a rock covered in strange gray lumps, and decided to become a hero. Watch any coastline today, and you'll see the same behavior all around you. Gulls drop shells from the air to crack them open. Sea otters crack clams against stones balanced on their stomachs. Crabs pry open mussels with their claws. Animals had already been eating shellfish for millions of years before your ancestors ever showed up to the party. The far more likely story is quieter, and honestly, a little less flattering to your ego. Someone was starving. The plants were gone. The herds had moved on or died. The coast was the only option left standing. And on that coast, other creatures were clearly finding a way to eat. Psychologists have a name for the instinct that should have stopped this from happening in the first place. Food, neophobia, the built-in caution most animals feel toward eating something new and unfamiliar. It's the same wiring that makes a toddler refuse a vegetable they've never seen, or makes you hesitate before trying a strange dish in a foreign country. That caution exists for a good reason. New foods can be poisonous, unfamiliar foods can kill you. But hunger is a stronger force than caution. Hunger doesn't ask permission, and it doesn't wait for bravery. It simply overrides the warning system again and again until eventually someone's hand closes around a shell and they eat. That, more than courage, is probably what put the first oyster into a human mouth. Not boldness, but observation, paired with the oldest motivator there is. You still carry that same wiring, by the way. It's why you hesitate before trying sushi for the first time, or raw oysters, or the strange-looking dish your friend swears is delicious. Somewhere underneath the hesitation is the same ancient caution that once protected your ancestors from eating something that could kill them. The difference is you don't need hunger to override it anymore. Curiosity does the job instead. Or peer pressure. Or a menu with a price tag that suggests the risk is worth taking. Same wiring, completely different stakes. What once decided whether your ancestors lived through a season now only decides whether you enjoy your appetizer. Which brings you back to that raw bar. The $5 oyster sitting on a bed of ice with a wedge of lemon and a tiny fork beside it. You reach for it because it feels indulgent. A small, deliberate luxury. Proof that you can afford something a little wild, a little untamed, on a Tuesday night. But nearly every part of that ritual, the ice, the shell, the briny cold taste, is an echo of a much older story. One where that same food wasn't a luxury at all. It was the only thing standing between your ancestors and extinction. Think about how strange that inversion really is. The exact food that once meant your species was down to its last few hundred people now sits on a menu as a symbol of wealth and celebration. Oysters, lobster, escargot. Lobster, in particular, tells almost the same story on a smaller timescale. In colonial New England, it was considered such a low, undesirable food that it was fed to servants and prisoners, sometimes with contracts limiting how often they could be served it. It took better transportation, clever marketing, and a shrinking supply to turn it into the centerpiece of an expensive dinner. Status, it turns out, has very little to do with what a food actually is, and a lot to do with how scarce, or how fashionable, it happens to be at a given moment in history. You don't taste desperation when you eat an oyster today. You taste briny, and cold, and faintly sweet. But the reason your species survived long enough to build restaurants and raw bars and menus with prices on them at all traces back to a handful of caves on a South African cliff and to people who were paying very close attention to what the tide left behind. They weren't chasing pleasure. They were chasing one more day alive. And in a strange way, that's the real theme running underneath this entire story. Not bravery, not indulgence, resilience, quiet and unglamorous, repeated meal after meal by people who never knew they were making history. Your species didn't survive its worst chapter because someone was fearless. It survived because enough people kept paying attention, kept adapting, and kept refusing to stop eating. So the next time a stranger somewhere in the world lifts a shell to their lips, look a little closer at what that gesture actually is. It isn't a stranger performing indulgence for an evening. It's the latest link in a chain of behavior stretching back over 160,000 years, connecting a $5 appetizer on a bed of ice to the small, hungry handful of humans who almost didn't make it at all.